Welcome to Strides to Solutions with Esther Adams, where we explore the intersection of clinical psychology, neuroscience, and real world application to help you navigate life's complexities with greater skill and understanding. I'm Esther, and today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and frustrating aspects of human psychology: our ability, or often our inability, to change our own behavior. If you've ever sworn off late night snacking only to find yourself elbow deep in a bag of chips at midnight, or promised yourself you'd speak up in that meeting only to sit silently through yet another discussion where your ideas went unvoiced, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The gap between who we want to be and how we actually behave can feel like an unbridgeable chasm, and today we're going to explore why that is, and more importantly, what we can actually do about it. Welcome to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams. Today we are exploring the intersection of clinical psychology, neuroscience, and real world application to help you navigate life's complexities with greater skill and understanding. If you've ever found yourself trapped in a behavioral loop, knowing exactly what you should do differently, but somehow unable to actually do it, today's episode is for you. We're going beyond the typical self help platitudes about willpower and motivation to explore what really happens in our brains and bodies when we try to change. Whether it's the inability to say no that leaves you overwhelmed and resentful, the aggressive patterns that push people away, or any behavior that creates a gap between who you want to be and how you actually show up in the world. We're going to unpack why change is so difficult and, more importantly, what actually works when willpower doesn't. There's an old joke in psychology circles: how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? One. But the light bulb has really got to want to change. It's a groaner, I know, but it captures something essential about the nature of behavioral change. We can have all the knowledge in the world about what we should do differently. We can understand perfectly well why our current patterns aren't serving us, and yet somehow we find ourselves stuck in the same loops, repeating the same behaviors that we consciously know are problematic. The landscape of self-improvement is littered with failed attempts at change. Consider the statistics on New Year's resolutions. By February, about 80% of them have been abandoned. Diet programs have a failure rate that would bankrupt any other industry. People leave therapy with brilliant insights about their patterns, only to fall right back into them the moment life gets stressful. What's going on here? Are we just fundamentally weak-willed creatures doomed to repeat our mistakes indefinitely? The answer, fortunately, is no, but the reality of behavior change is far more complex than most self-help literature would have you believe. It's not just about willpower, though that plays a role. It's not just about motivation, though that matters too. And it's certainly not just about having the right information, though knowledge is part of the equation. Behavior change is actually a complex interplay of psychological, biological, and social factors, all of which need to be understood and addressed if we're going to successfully alter our patterns of action. To understand behavior modification, we first need to understand what behavior actually is in psychological terms. When psychologists talk about behavior, we're not just talking about actions. We're talking about the visible manifestation of an entire internal system. Think of behavior as the tip of an iceberg. What you see above the water, the action itself, is supported by a massive structure beneath the surface consisting of values, attitudes, beliefs, emotions, past experiences, biological predispositions, and social influences. Values are those abstract qualities that give meaning to our lives, things like freedom, security, creativity, connection. They're often intangible and sometimes contradictory. You might value both adventure and safety, both independence and belonging. These values form early in life, absorbed from our families, our cultures, our early experiences. They become so fundamental to our sense of self that we rarely examine them consciously. From these values spring our attitudes, our evaluative responses to the world around us. If you value health, you might have positive attitudes toward exercise and negative attitudes toward smoking. But here's where it gets interesting. Attitudes don't always align neatly with values. You might value health, but have negative attitudes toward exercise because of painful experiences in gym class or feelings of shame about your body. This misalignment between values and attitudes is often where behavioral problems begin. And then there are the behaviors themselves, the actions we take or don't take based on this complex internal landscape. Behaviors are where the rubber meets the road, where our internal world becomes external reality. They're also where we most acutely feel the disconnect between who we want to be and who we are. Because while we might not be fully conscious of our values and attitudes, we can't help but notice our behaviors. They're right there, undeniable, often embarrassing, sometimes destructive. What makes behavior particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is how it becomes patterned. We don't just act randomly, we develop habits, routines, predictable responses to certain situations. These patterns served us at some point. Maybe they helped us survive childhood. Maybe they helped us fit in during adolescence. Maybe they helped us cope with a difficult period in our lives. But patterns that were adaptive in one context can become maladaptive in another. And that's often when we find ourselves wanting to change. The classical understanding of how behaviors develop comes from the work of Ivan Pavlov and his famous dogs. Pavlov discovered that behaviors could be conditioned. That is, we could learn to respond automatically to certain stimuli based on past associations. Ring a bell when you feed a dog, and eventually the dog salivates just at the sound of the bell. This might seem like it only applies to simple reflexive behaviors, but classical conditioning shapes our lives in countless ways. I once worked with a client who couldn't understand why she felt anxious every time she smelled a particular cologne. Through our work together, she remembered that her emotionally abusive ex boyfriend had worn that scent. Her anxiety response had become conditioned to that smell, operating below the level of conscious awareness. This is classical conditioning at work. Our bodies learn to respond to environmental cues based on past experiences, and these learned responses can persist long after they're no longer relevant or helpful. Then there's operant conditioning, popularized by B. F. Skinner, which deals with voluntary behaviors, the choices we make consciously or unconsciously. The principle here is simple but powerful. Behaviors that are rewarded tend to be repeated, while behaviors that are punished tend to diminish. But here's the catch: what constitutes a reward or punishment isn't always obvious, and it isn't the same for everyone. Take procrastination, for instance. On the surface, it seems like procrastination should be naturally punished by the stress and poor outcomes it creates. But for many people, procrastination is actually rewarded in the short term by relief from anxiety about the task, by the adrenaline rush of working under pressure, or by avoiding the possibility of failure. The immediate reward outweighs the delayed punishment, and so the behavior persists. This is one of the fundamental challenges of behavior change. Our brains are wired to prioritize immediate rewards over long term benefits. This made perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. Our ancestors who ate the food in front of them, rather than saving it for later, were more likely to survive. But in our modern world, where the threats are chronic rather than acute and where many rewards are delayed, this wiring works against us. There's also the phenomenon of modeling, learning behaviors by observing others. We're social creatures, and from infancy, we learn by watching and imitating those around us. This isn't just about conscious imitation. We absorb behavioral patterns from our environment without even realizing it. If you grew up in a household where conflict was handled through yelling, you might find yourself raising your voice during disagreements, even if you consciously believe that's not the best approach. If you work in an office where everyone eats lunch at their desks, you might find yourself doing the same, even if you value work life balance. Understanding these mechanisms of behavioral development is crucial because it helps us recognize that our behaviors aren't simply choices we're making in a vacuum. They're the product of conditioning, reinforcement, and social learning that has been happening since we were born. This doesn't mean we're helpless victims of our conditioning, but it does mean that changing behavior requires more than just deciding to act differently. So, how do we actually change behavior? The field of behavioral psychology has developed various models, but most share common elements. First, there's usually a stage of pre awareness or denial. We don't recognize that our behavior is problematic, or we recognize it but minimize its impact. Sure, I drink most evenings, but it's just to unwind. Everyone does it. This stage can last years, even decades. Then something happens that pierces through the denial. Maybe it's a health scare, a relationship crisis, a moment of clarity where we see ourselves as we really are rather than as we imagine ourselves to be. This leads to awareness, the recognition that yes, this behavior is a problem and yes, it needs to change. But awareness alone isn't enough. I've worked with countless clients who were exquisitely aware of their problematic behaviors but felt powerless to change them. This is because awareness without desire is just painful knowledge. The desire to change has to come from within, and it has to be stronger than the desire to maintain the status quo. This is where many behavior change attempts fail. We think we should want to change, but deep down, we're ambivalent. The desire to change often emerges when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the perceived pain of changing. Psychologists call this hitting bottom, though the bottom is different for everyone. For some people, it's a dramatic crisis. For others, it's a quiet moment of recognition that life isn't what they want it to be. Once genuine desire is present, the actual work of change begins. This typically involves what we call cognitive restructuring, changing the thoughts and beliefs that support the problematic behavior. If you believe you're worthless, it's hard to engage in self care behaviors. If you believe the world is dangerous, it's hard to take healthy risks. Changing behavior often requires changing the cognitive infrastructure that supports it. Then comes behavioral substitution, actually doing something different. This sounds simple, but it's incredibly difficult. Our old behaviors are like well worn paths through a forest, easy to follow, requiring no thought. New behaviors are like bushwhacking through undergrowth, effortful, uncomfortable, uncertain. It takes tremendous energy to choose the new path, especially when we're tired, stressed, or triggered. This is why most behavior change attempts fail during times of stress. Stress depletes our cognitive resources, our willpower, our ability to make conscious choices. Under stress, we revert to our most deeply ingrained patterns. The drink after a hard day, the cigarette during a crisis, the retreat into isolation when things get tough. These are the behavioral equivalents of muscle memory, and they reassert themselves powerfully when we're vulnerable. James Prochaska's Stages of Change model acknowledges this reality by including relapse as a normal, expected part of the change process. According to Prochaska, people don't just decide to change and then change. Instead, they move through stages: pre contemplation, not thinking about change; contemplation, thinking about it; determination, deciding to do it; action, doing it; maintenance, keeping it going; and often relapse, falling back into old patterns. What's revolutionary about this model is that it normalizes relapse. Instead of seeing relapse as failure, Prochaska frames it as part of the learning process. Each time we attempt change, even if we don't sustain it, we learn something. We identify triggers we hadn't noticed before. We discover which strategies work and which don't. We build what psychologists call change muscles, the capacity to tolerate the discomfort of doing things differently. This is particularly important when we're dealing with addictive behaviors. Addiction hijacks the brain's reward system, creating powerful biological drives that can override conscious intention. The idea that someone with an addiction should just be able to stop through willpower alone is like saying someone with diabetes should be able to regulate their blood sugar through positive thinking. It misunderstands the biological reality of what's happening. But even non addictive behaviors can have surprisingly strong holds on us. They become part of our identity, our daily rhythm, our way of managing emotions. The person who always says yes to requests might genuinely want to set better boundaries, but saying no feels like a betrayal of who they are. The person who avoids conflict might want to be more assertive, but confrontation feels like an existential threat. This is where the concept of assertiveness becomes particularly relevant. Assertiveness is one of those psychological terms that's entered common usage, but is often misunderstood. People often think assertiveness means being aggressive or domineering, but that's not it at all. Assertiveness is actually the middle path between passivity and aggression. Passive behavior is when we fail to express our needs, wants, or boundaries. We go along with what others want, even when it's not good for us. We swallow our feelings, avoid confrontation, and often end up feeling resentful and victimized. Passive behavior might seem peaceful on the surface, but it's actually a breeding ground for inner turmoil. Aggressive behavior is the opposite extreme. We express our needs, but in ways that violate others' boundaries. We might get what we want in the short term, but we damage relationships and create conflicts that come back to haunt us. Aggressive behavior might feel powerful in the moment, but it's ultimately isolating and self defeating. Assertiveness is the sweet spot, expressing our needs, wants, and boundaries clearly and directly while respecting others' rights to do the same. It's standing up for ourselves without standing on others. It sounds simple, but for many of us, it's incredibly difficult. We've been conditioned to be either passive or aggressive, and finding that middle ground requires learning entirely new skills. One of the fundamental assertiveness skills is learning to say no. This sounds basic, but for many people, it's revolutionary. We've been taught that saying no is rude, selfish, mean. We fear that if we say no, people won't like us, won't need us, won't value us. So we say yes to things we don't want to do, can't reasonably do, or that actively harm us. Learning to say no requires recognizing that other people's needs are not automatically more important than our own. It requires accepting that we can't solve everyone's problems, meet everyone's expectations, or be everything to everyone. It requires tolerating the discomfort of potentially disappointing others. For people who have built their identity around being helpful, agreeable, or accommodating, this can feel like death. But here's what I've observed in my practice: people who learn to say appropriate no's actually become more helpful, not less. When they say yes, it's a genuine yes, not a resentful compliance. They have more energy for the things that truly matter to them. Their relationships become more authentic because they're not constantly suppressing their true feelings. Another crucial assertiveness skill is using I statements. Instead of you always or you never, we learn to say I feel or I need. This might seem like semantic nitpicking, but it's actually profound. When we use you statements, we're making accusations. When we use I statements, we're taking ownership of our experience. One invites defensiveness, the other invites dialogue. I remember working with a couple where every conversation turned into a battle. She would say, "You never listened to me." And he would immediately start listing all the times he had listened. He would say, "You're always criticizing me." And she would defend herself by explaining why her comments weren't criticism. They were locked in a cycle of accusation and defense. When they learned to use I statements, I feel unheard and I feel criticized, everything changed. Instead of debating whether the accusation was accurate, they could explore the feeling itself. He could be curious about why she felt unheard. She could be interested in how her comments were landing as criticism. The conversation shifted from combat to collaboration. Eye contact is another component of assertiveness that's more complex than it might seem. Too little eye contact communicates insecurity, dishonesty, or disinterest. Too much becomes aggressive, invasive. Appropriate eye contact, maintained for a few seconds at a time, broken naturally, resumed comfortably, communicates confidence and engagement without threat. For people who've been socialized to be passive, maintaining eye contact while expressing a need or boundary can feel almost impossible. The vulnerability is too intense. For people who tend toward aggression, softening their gaze while maintaining contact can feel like weakness. Both are learning to inhabit their bodies differently, to present themselves to the world in a new way. Body language, more generally, is crucial to assertiveness. You can say all the right words, but if your body is screaming something different, that's what people will hear. Shoulders hunched, arms crossed, body turned away. These communicate withdrawal, fear, closure. Chest puffed out, fists clenched, invading personal space. These communicate threat. The assertive body is open but not vulnerable, grounded but not rigid, present but not invasive. There's also the skill of what I call peaceful disagreement, the ability to hold a different opinion or perspective without either suppressing it or weaponizing it. In our increasingly polarized world, this skill feels almost extinct. We either avoid any topic that might lead to disagreement, or we turn disagreement into warfare. Neither serves us well. Peaceful disagreement requires several capacities. First, the ability to genuinely listen to and understand another perspective without immediately judging it. Second, the ability to articulate our own perspective clearly without needing to demolish the other person's. Third, the ability to tolerate the discomfort of unresolved difference. Not every disagreement needs to end with someone being right and someone being wrong. Sometimes two perspectives can coexist. These assertiveness skills aren't just about communication, they're about fundamentally reimagining our place in the world. For someone who's been passive, learning assertiveness means recognizing that they have a right to take up space, to have needs, to set boundaries. For someone who's been aggressive, it means recognizing that other people are not obstacles to overcome, but fellow humans deserving of respect. The process of developing these skills is often uncomfortable, sometimes painful. We're not just learning new behaviors, we're challenging deep seated beliefs about ourselves and our place in the world. The passive person learning to assert themselves might have to confront beliefs like, my needs don't matter, or I'm not important enough to make demands. The aggressive person learning to moderate might have to face fears like, if I'm not in control, I'm vulnerable, or if I don't fight, I'll be defeated. This is why behavior change so often requires therapeutic support. It's not just about learning techniques, it's about exploring the psychological landscape that makes current behaviors feel necessary. What are we protecting ourselves from? What are we afraid will happen if we change? What old wounds are we nursing? What stories are we telling ourselves about who we are and what we deserve? In my practice, I often see people who intellectually understand exactly what they need to do differently, but feel paralyzed when it comes to actually doing it. They know they should set boundaries with their toxic family member, but every time they try, they're flooded with guilt. They know they should ask for that raise, but when the moment comes, the words stick in their throat. They know they should leave that unhealthy relationship, but they can't seem to take the first step. This paralysis often comes from what we might call competing commitments. On one level, they're committed to changing, but on a deeper level, they're committed to something that the current behavior protects. The person who can't set boundaries might be deeply committed to being seen as good, kind, selfless. The person who can't ask for a raise might be committed to staying safe, not risking rejection. The person who can't leave the relationship might be committed to not being alone, even if alone would be healthier than their current situation. Identifying these competing commitments is crucial for successful behavior change. Until we acknowledge what we're protecting with our current behavior, we can't realistically assess whether we're willing to risk losing it, and sometimes we decide we're not. Sometimes the cost of change really is too high, at least right now. And that's okay. Not every behavior needs to be changed, and not every change needs to happen immediately. But when we are ready to change, when the cost of staying the same has become unbearable, understanding these dynamics can make the difference between success and another failed attempt. It helps us anticipate where we're likely to struggle. It helps us prepare for the feelings that will arise. It helps us develop strategies for managing the discomfort of change. One strategy that's particularly helpful is what we call graduated exposure. Instead of trying to completely change a behavior all at once, we change it incrementally. The person learning to say no might start by saying no to small requests from strangers, then work up to saying no to larger requests from friends. The person learning to be more assertive might practice first in low stakes situations before tackling the big confrontation with their boss. This graduated approach serves several purposes. It builds confidence through small successes. It allows us to develop skills progressively rather than having to master everything at once. It helps us identify and work through obstacles in manageable doses. And it reduces the likelihood of becoming so overwhelmed that we give up entirely. Another helpful strategy is identifying what we call antecedents, the triggers that set off our problematic behaviors. These might be external, certain people, places, situations, or internal, emotions, thoughts, physical states. The person trying to quit smoking might notice they always want a cigarette when they're stressed. The person trying to stop overeating might realize they binge when they're lonely. The person trying to be less aggressive might recognize that they lash out when they feel criticized. Once we identify these antecedents, we can develop specific strategies for dealing with them. Maybe we avoid certain triggers when possible. Maybe we prepare coping strategies for unavoidable triggers. Maybe we work on addressing the underlying issue that makes something a trigger in the first place. The key is moving from reactive to proactive, from being ambushed by our triggers to anticipating and managing them. The role of social support in behavior change cannot be overstated. We're social creatures, and our behaviors exist in social contexts. Trying to change behavior while surrounded by people who reinforce the old patterns is like trying to stay dry while standing in the rain. It's theoretically possible, but it requires enormous effort and is unlikely to succeed long term. This doesn't mean we need to completely overhaul our social circles, though sometimes that is necessary. But we do need to be mindful of how our relationships support or undermine our change efforts. We might need to set boundaries with people who sabotage our efforts. We might need to seek out new relationships that support our new direction. We might need to have difficult conversations with loved ones about how they can help rather than hinder. I think of a client who was trying to develop better work life boundaries. Every time she tried to leave the office at a reasonable hour, her colleagues would make comments like, "Must be nice to have so little to do," or "leaving early again." These comments triggered her people pleasing tendencies and her fear of being seen as not hardworking enough. She would end up staying late, reinforcing the very pattern she was trying to break. Part of her behavior change process involved recognizing these social dynamics and developing strategies for dealing with them. She practiced responses to her colleagues' comments. She found allies in the office who also wanted better boundaries. She had conversations with her supervisor about expectations and performance metrics. The behavior change wasn't just about her individual choice to leave on time, it was about navigating the social system in which that choice existed. There's also the biological dimension of behavior change that we can't ignore. Our behaviors are influenced by our neurochemistry, our hormones, our genetic predispositions, our physical health. Someone with ADHD might struggle with behaviors related to focus and impulse control, not because they're lazy or undisciplined, but because their brain functions differently. Someone with depression might struggle with self care behaviors, not because they don't care about themselves, but because their illness saps their energy and motivation. This biological dimension means that sometimes behavior change requires more than psychological intervention. It might require medication to address underlying neurochemical imbalances. It might require addressing physical health issues that affect energy and mood. It might require understanding and working with our biological rhythms rather than against them. The interaction between biology and behavior is bidirectional. Our behaviors influence our biology just as our biology influences our behaviors. Regular exercise changes our neurochemistry in ways that make it easier to maintain other positive behaviors. Good sleep hygiene improves our cognitive function and emotional regulation. Stress management techniques actually alter our stress response system at a biological level. This is why comprehensive behavior change programs often take what's called a biopsychosocial approach, addressing biological, psychological, and social factors simultaneously. It's not enough to just learn new skills or just take medication or just change our social environment. Lasting change usually requires intervention at multiple levels. The timeline for behavior change is another crucial factor that's often misunderstood. Popular culture tells us it takes 21 days to form a habit, but research suggests it's more like 66 days on average and can range from 18 to 254 days, depending on the person and the behavior. More complex behaviors take longer to establish. Behaviors that require overriding strong existing patterns take longer still. This extended timeline can be discouraging, but understanding it is actually liberating. It means that struggling in the first week or month doesn't mean we're failing. It means we're normal. It means that behavior change is a marathon, not a sprint. It means we need to pace ourselves, be patient with ourselves, and maintain realistic expectations. The concept of willpower in behavior change is particularly interesting and often misunderstood. We tend to think of willpower as a character trait. Some people have it, others don't. But research suggests willpower is more like a muscle. It can be strengthened with practice, but it can also be depleted with overuse. This is why trying to change too many behaviors at once often fails. We simply don't have enough willpower to maintain multiple changes simultaneously. Understanding willpower as a limited resource has important implications for behavior change. It means we need to be strategic about when and how we deploy our willpower. It means we need to structure our environment to minimize the need for willpower. It means we need to recognize when our willpower is depleted and have backup strategies for those times. For instance, if you're trying to eat healthier, relying on willpower to resist junk food is a losing strategy. Instead, you might not keep junk food in the house so you don't have to resist it. You might prep healthy meals when your willpower is strong so they're available when it's weak. You might identify the times when your willpower is lowest, often evening for many people, and have specific strategies for those danger zones. The role of identity in behavior change is something that's often overlooked but is incredibly powerful. We tend to behave in ways that are consistent with our sense of who we are. If you see yourself as not a morning person, you're unlikely to successfully establish a morning exercise routine. If you identify as bad with money, you'll struggle to maintain good financial habits. Successful behavior change often involves identity shift. Instead of, I'm trying to quit smoking, it becomes, I'm a non smoker. Instead of, I'm trying to be more organized, it becomes, I'm an organized person. This isn't just positive thinking or fake it till you make it. It's recognizing that our behaviors flow from our identity, and changing behaviors might require reimagining who we are. This identity shift can be particularly challenging when our current identity, however problematic, serves important psychological functions. The person who identifies as a workaholic might derive their entire sense of worth from their productivity. Changing their work habits means confronting questions about their value as a person. The person who identifies as a caretaker might feel lost without others' needs to fulfill. Setting boundaries means figuring out who they are when they're not taking care of everyone else. Cultural factors also play a huge role in behavior change, though they're often invisible to us. Every culture has norms about appropriate behavior, and violating these norms, even in healthy ways, can trigger intense discomfort. In cultures that prioritize family harmony, learning to assert individual needs can feel like betrayal. In cultures that value stoicism, learning to express emotions can feel like weakness. I've worked with clients from collectivist cultures who intellectually understood the importance of setting boundaries, but felt physically ill when they tried to do it. The cultural programming was so deep that their bodies rebelled against the behavior change. Working with these clients required acknowledging and respecting the cultural dimension while helping them find ways to meet their needs that felt culturally syntonic. Gender socialization adds another layer of complexity. Men in our culture are often socialized to be aggressive, to suppress vulnerable emotions, to solve rather than discuss problems. Learning to be vulnerable, to express fear or sadness, to seek help. These behavior changes require overcoming decades of programming about what it means to be a man. Women are often socialized to be passive, to prioritize others' needs, to avoid conflict, learning to be assertive, to prioritize their own needs, to engage in healthy conflict. These changes challenge fundamental messages about femininity and worth. The behavior change isn't just about learning new skills, it's about challenging deeply internalized beliefs about gender and value. The role of trauma in shaping behavior patterns is something we're only beginning to fully understand. Trauma, especially early trauma, can create powerful behavioral patterns that feel essential to survival. The hypervigilance of someone who experienced abuse, the people pleasing of someone who grew up in chaos, the emotional numbing of someone who experienced overwhelming loss. These aren't just bad habits to be broken, but protective strategies that once kept someone alive, literally or psychologically. Changing trauma based behavior patterns requires particular sensitivity and often professional support. We can't just rip away someone's protective strategies without ensuring they have other ways to feel safe. The behavior change process might need to include trauma processing, building internal resources, developing new coping strategies, and gradually testing whether the old protections are still needed. I think of a client who couldn't stop people pleasing despite how exhausting and self betraying it was. Through our work, she realized this pattern developed in childhood with an emotionally volatile parent. Being hyper attuned to others' needs and managing their emotions was how she stayed safe. As an adult, the pattern was causing problems, but her nervous system still believed it was necessary for survival. The behavior change process had to include not just learning new skills, but convincing her nervous system that she was safe enough to use them. The concept of secondary gains is another important consideration in behavior change. Sometimes our problematic behaviors provide hidden benefits that we're reluctant to give up. The person with chronic pain might receive care and attention they don't know how to ask for directly. The person who procrastinates might avoid the risk of having their work fully judged. The person who stays in an unhealthy relationship might avoid confronting their fear of being alone. These secondary gains aren't usually conscious, and people often feel ashamed when they recognize them, but acknowledging them is crucial for successful change. If we don't address what the problematic behavior is providing, we're likely to either fail at changing it or to develop new problematic behaviors that serve the same function. There's also the phenomenon of what we might call behavioral ecology, the way behaviors exist in interconnected systems. Changing one behavior often requires or results in changes to other behaviors. If you start exercising regularly, you might naturally start eating better and sleeping more. But you might also have less time for certain relationships or activities, which could trigger other changes. Understanding this interconnectedness helps us anticipate and plan for the ripple effects of behavior change. It helps us recognize that we're not just changing a single behavior, but potentially reorganizing our entire life. This can be overwhelming, but it can also be exciting. One positive change can catalyze a cascade of other positive changes. The role of meaning and purpose in behavior change is something Viktor Frankl wrote about extensively. We're more likely to sustain difficult changes when they're connected to something larger than ourselves. The person quitting smoking because their doctor told them to might struggle more than the person quitting because they want to be there for their grandchildren. The why behind the change matters as much as the how. This doesn't mean we need some grand, noble purpose for every behavior change, but connecting the change to our values, to what matters most to us, provides motivation that can sustain us through the difficult parts of the process. It transforms behavior change from something we have to do to something we choose to do in service of what we care about. The phenomenon of decision fatigue is another factor that affects behavior change. We only have so much decision making capacity in a day, and every decision depletes that capacity. By evening, we might simply not have the cognitive resources to make good choices. This is why many people find their problematic behaviors emerge or intensify at certain times of day. Successful behavior change often involves reducing the number of decisions required. This might mean establishing routines so behaviors become automatic. It might mean making decisions in advance when our cognitive resources are fresh. It might mean simplifying our lives so we have more decision making capacity available for the changes that matter most. The distinction between behavior change and behavior management is important. Sometimes complete elimination of a problematic behavior isn't realistic or necessary. Instead, we might focus on managing the behavior, reducing its frequency, minimizing its impact, developing strategies for damage control. The person with a shopping addiction might not need to never shop again, but might need to learn to shop within limits. This management approach can feel like failure to people who are aiming for complete change, but it's often more sustainable and realistic. Perfect is the enemy of good, and insisting on complete elimination of a behavior can prevent us from making meaningful progress. Sometimes reducing a behavior by 80% is a massive victory, even if that last 20% remains. The concept of harm reduction, borrowed from addiction treatment, is relevant here. Instead of insisting on complete abstinence, harm reduction focuses on minimizing the negative consequences of a behavior. This might mean using clean needles if you're going to inject drugs, or eating 1 pint of ice cream instead of 3 if you're going to binge. It's not ideal, but it's better, and better is still progress. There's often a grieving process involved in behavior change that doesn't get talked about enough. Even when we're changing behaviors we know are problematic, we might feel a sense of loss. We're losing familiar patterns, comfortable routines, sometimes entire identities. The person giving up alcohol might grieve the social ease it provided. The person learning to set boundaries might grieve the simplicity of just going along with everyone. This grief is normal and needs to be acknowledged. Trying to bypass it or pretend it doesn't exist often leads to unconscious sabotage of the change process. We need to honor what we're losing even as we move towards something better. Sometimes this involves actual mourning rituals, writing a goodbye letter to the old behavior, having a ceremony to mark the transition, creating space to feel the sadness of letting go. The role of self compassion in behavior change cannot be overstated. We often think being hard on ourselves will motivate change, but research consistently shows the opposite. Self criticism activates our threat response system, which actually makes us more likely to engage in comfort seeking behaviors, including the very behaviors we're trying to change. Self compassion, on the other hand, activates our caregiving system, which gives us the emotional resources to make difficult changes. When we treat ourselves with kindness, acknowledging that struggle is part of being human, we're more likely to persist through setbacks. We're more likely to learn from mistakes rather than being devastated by them. We're more likely to maintain changes long term. This doesn't mean letting ourselves off the hook or making excuses. It means holding ourselves accountable with kindness rather than harshness. It means recognizing that behavior change is difficult for everyone, that setbacks are normal, that perfection isn't the goal. It means talking to ourselves the way we would talk to a good friend who was struggling with the same issue. The distinction between external and internal motivation is crucial for sustainable behavior change. External motivation, rewards, punishments, social pressure, can jumpstart change, but it rarely sustains it. Once the external motivator is removed, the behavior often reverts. Internal motivation, personal values, intrinsic satisfaction, sense of identity, is what maintains change over time. The transition from external to internal motivation is a key part of the behavior change process. We might start exercising because our doctor scared us about our health, external, but we continue because we discover we enjoy how it makes us feel, internal. We might start therapy because our partner threatened to leave, external, but we continue because we value personal growth, Internal. Understanding where our motivation comes from helps us assess the likelihood of sustaining change. If all our motivation is external, we might need to either find internal motivators or accept that the change might be temporary. There's nothing wrong with temporary change if that's what's needed, but having realistic expectations prevents unnecessary feelings of failure. The concept of behavioral activation from the treatment of depression has broader applications for behavior change. Sometimes we wait to feel motivated before taking action, but behavioral activation suggests the opposite approach. Take action first, and motivation will follow. Don't wait to feel like exercising. Exercise and notice how you feel after. Don't wait to want to socialize. Socialize and see if enjoyment emerges. This approach recognizes that our emotions and behaviors are bidirectionally related. Just as our emotions influence our behaviors influence our emotions. By changing what we do, we can change how we feel, which then makes it easier to maintain the behavior change. It's a positive cycle that can be initiated from either point. The importance of celebrating small wins in the behavior change process is something I emphasize with all my clients. We tend to focus on how far we still have to go rather than how far we've come. We dismiss small progress as insignificant, but small wins build momentum, confidence, and evidence that change is possible. Celebration doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be as simple as acknowledging to yourself, I did it. It can be sharing your success with a supportive friend. It can be keeping a record of your progress. The key is consciously marking the achievement rather than immediately moving on to the next challenge. Our brains need this positive reinforcement to strengthen new neural pathways. The role of environment in behavior change is often underestimated. We like to think our behaviors are under our conscious control, but environment exerts a powerful influence. The person trying to drink less who keeps alcohol in the house is fighting an uphill battle. The person trying to focus who works in a chaotic environment faces constant challenges. Modifying our environment to support desired behaviors and discourage problematic ones is often easier than relying on willpower alone. This might mean reorganizing physical spaces, changing social environments, or altering daily routines. It's about making the desired behavior the path of least resistance, and the problematic behavior require more effort. As we think about the long arc of behavior change, it's important to recognize that change is rarely linear. There will be progress and setbacks, breakthroughs and plateaus. What looks like failure might actually be important learning. What feels like going backwards might be gathering energy for the next leap forward. The metaphor I often use with clients is learning to ride a bike. You don't get on a bike for the first time and ride smoothly. You wobble, you fall, you get back up. Each fall teaches you something about balance. Each wobble builds the muscles and neural pathways you need. Eventually, riding becomes second nature, but getting there involves a lot of imperfect attempts. The same is true for behavior change. Each attempt, even if it doesn't result in permanent change, builds skills, awareness, and capacity. We learn what triggers us, what strategies work, what support we need. We develop what researchers call change efficacy, confidence in our ability to make changes. This accumulates over time, making future changes more likely to succeed. There's also the reality that some behaviors might need to be changed multiple times throughout our lives. The strategies that help us quit smoking in our 20s might not work in our 40s. The boundaries that were appropriate in one relationship might need adjustment in another. Change isn't a one and done proposition, but an ongoing process of adaptation and growth. As we wrap up this exploration of behavior modification, I want to emphasize that the goal isn't to become some perfected version of ourselves with no problematic behaviors. That's neither realistic nor necessary. We're all works in progress, all struggling with something, all carrying patterns that sometimes serve us and sometimes don't. The goal is to develop agency in relation to our behaviors, to move from unconscious reaction to conscious choice, from helpless repetition to intentional action. It's about recognizing that while we can't control everything about our lives, we have more influence over our behaviors than we might think. Not perfect control, not complete freedom, but genuine influence that can make a meaningful difference. This kind of agency doesn't develop overnight. It's built through countless small moments of awareness, choice, and action. It's strengthened by every time we pause before reacting, every time we choose the harder but healthier option, every time we get back up after a setback. It's not about never falling, but about getting better at getting back up. The journey of behavior change is ultimately a journey of self discovery. As we work to change our patterns, we learn about our values, our fears, our strengths, our growing edges. We discover what we're capable of when we push past our comfort zones. We learn what really matters to us when we have to choose between competing commitments. The person who emerges from a successful behavior change process isn't just someone with different habits, but someone with deeper self knowledge and greater capacity for intentional living. As we close today's episode of Strides to Solutions, I want to leave you with this truth. The behaviors you're struggling to change aren't evidence of weakness or failure, they're evidence of your humanity. Every pattern you've developed served a purpose at some point, even if it's outlived its usefulness now. The journey of behavior change isn't about becoming perfect. It's about developing agency, moving from unconscious reaction to conscious choice. If you're ready to dive deeper into transforming the patterns that shape your reality, my book, Rescript Your Reality, offers a groundbreaking approach to understanding and recalibrating your inner dialogue, that constant stream of thoughts and self talk that drives your behaviors. Available on Amazon, it provides practical tools for identifying the hidden scripts running your life and rewriting them in ways that align with who you're becoming rather than who you've been. Remember, change isn't a one time event, but an ongoing practice of awareness, choice, and self compassion. Start small. Notice one behavior pattern this week. Just notice it without judgment. That awareness itself is the first step toward transformation. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, this is Esther Adams reminding you that between stimulus and response lies your power to choose, and in that choice lies your freedom to grow.